Hi everyone, I'm Young Kim in Geography, and I'm a coordinator of the Western Poverty Theme and Activities. First of all, thanks for coming to this event. This is the Western Poverty Week on Inequality, Society and Inequality event. We have 5 talks, so you must have seen that poster there, so 5 talks there. Okay, then anyone who is interested in Western Poverty theme or certificate, you might pick up this from the back there. So this is just, I think we have a bunch of students from social work. There's a lot of overlap between your major and this certificate major. So classes too. Really good to kind of pursue this certificate. Thanks a lot. And today's speaker, Dr. Ike Uzuegbunam, is a visiting assistant professor in the College of Business in Ohio University. He received his PhD from Rensselaer, okay, in New York, and master's degree in technology and innovation management from University of Sussex in England, and bachelor's degree from University of Nigeria. Quite a global education there in Nigeria, UK, and New York, and Ohio. Always final destination, Ohio. Okay? And Ike also has ample consulting experience in medical industry and oil and gas, and even social sectors. And today, he will talk about the links between income inequality, entrepreneurial activity, and poverty alleviation. So without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Uzuegbunam.
Thank you. Thank you. Question. Do you want questions to come afterwards, or do you want questions in Well, thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. I got this invitation to participate in the Wealth and Poverty Week events, and I was really excited about being a part of this program because this is a topic that is really very close to me, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Douglas Cumming and I of York University have been grappling with this issue of inequality, poverty, and entrepreneurship for the last 3 years. We've been studying this, trying to figure out if you're looking at it from the state level, if you're looking at it from the standpoint that states have a role to play in forming an environment that would allow entrepreneurship to thrive, and hopefully an environment that would allow us to alleviate poverty, then we wanted to understand the links between these 3 variables. Okay? So that was a key motivation to get into this. But another motivation, Young mentioned that I'm from Nigeria, another motivation is from this sort of picture, right? This picture is very motivating to actually engage in this sort of topic. So the story behind the picture is that right here you have an entrepreneur, self-made Nigerian entrepreneur, Tony Elumelu, okay, who last year, in 2015, was able to commit $100 million of his own personal fortune to try to develop 10,000 African entrepreneurs. So in his own perspective, this is the sort of thing that we need to do to develop Africa. In other words, he believes in this commitment that entrepreneurship is an instrument for poverty alleviation and for eradicating poverty in society. So that is an example of what is happening in Africa from where I come from. So obviously being in a society like Nigeria, being in a society like Africa, I was able to witness gross inequality, gross income inequality, and poverty. So that was obviously a motivating factor to come to this question. So let's move ahead, let's fast forward. Coming to America, right? In the United States, despite the progress we've made, there are still problems related to inequality, problems related to poverty that we need to attend to. And this quote here from President Obama, which is available on the White House website, is a good example of what the efforts look like in the US. So I'll give you a minute to read some of the key points in Obama's statement to digest what he's saying. So who understands the premise of what Obama is saying, President Obama is saying? Yes?
It's just saying that entrepreneurs are important to America because not only are they what America was built on, but it also is helpful in creating jobs and furthering the economy.
That's right. Thank you very much. And is that a statement that we've all heard? Do you guys feel like you hear it a lot, right? That we come to take it for granted, that we think that entrepreneurship is an instrument for poverty alleviation. Now, as simple as the statement sounds, and as easy as it seems that having an entrepreneurial venture would eradicate poverty, is not that simple. And when we come to this question, we recognize that there are differences between different types of entrepreneurial activity. Okay? So that's part of the things that motivate us to look at this a bit further than the prior literature has looked at. So what is entrepreneurship? Entrepreneurship has been defined for centuries, right? Back in the 18th century, Richard Cantillon talks about entrepreneurship as being the risk of buying at certain prices and then selling at uncertain prices. This is an 18th century definition. And then, of course, John Baptist Say, around the same time, came up with this notion. In fact, it was John Baptist Say that defined or used the word entrepreneur for the first time and said that entrepreneur is someone that is responsible for bringing together the factors of production. You folks know what factors of production are, right? Give me an example of a factor of production. Land is a factor of production. What else is a factor of production? Labor, capital, you name it, right? So that was sort of the insight from John Baptist Say that entrepreneurs, what they do is that they take an idea and they bring factors of production and they wrap it around the idea and they create something that would be very beneficial to society, that will make us all prosperous, right? So that's sort of the thinking behind this. So Joseph Schumpeter, an economist in 1911 initially, and later on in 1934, said you cannot define entrepreneurship without defining entrepreneurship as based on innovation. The fact that it involves innovation or making change in a manner that would enable economic growth, right? So I know some of you are familiar with social entrepreneurs. Social entrepreneurs are change agents, so they have to come up with innovative solutions as a way of moving society forward, right? So that definition of entrepreneurship in some ways have stuck with us because, as you can see, the current definition of entrepreneurship that is used in most places is this idea of the pursuit of opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. And this definition is so nice because it encapsulates the innovation aspect, but also the previous aspects. So let me explain what this means. If you look at this definition, what it's saying is that entrepreneurship is about behaviors, right? It's not just when someone starts a company, right? Because someone can start working for themselves, right? They can be a self-employed person without necessarily starting a company, but they might be able to create some value, and they could create it in an innovative way, and that makes them an entrepreneur. So it sort of expands the notion of what an entrepreneur is beyond the fact that it has to be when you go start a new company, okay? Now, if you think about what Amazon is doing, you guys have seen this picture before, right? The drones and so on. A lot of us consider that to be entrepreneurial. So we believe that entrepreneurship can also occur in existing companies, right? Can occur in existing companies like Amazon, where they're coming up with innovative new ideas that will make society better. In this study, we're not necessarily interested in this, but I wanted you to understand that entrepreneurship can be broader than what we're capturing in this study. So, since we know that entrepreneurs try to identify opportunities for innovation, since we accept this idea that entrepreneurs are in the business of trying to find ways to improve society, it's important to understand where do these ideas come from in the first place. So my students and I know that most times, most ideas that succeed in the marketplace are based on when entrepreneurs are trying to replicate something that they've encountered in previous employment. And this is an important fact for this study, but for a lot of what we're going to discuss later on in this class. Okay? The fact that prior employment increases the odds of entrepreneurs being successful. Okay, so prior employment broadly defined again. So what I want to take you through is different forms of entrepreneurial activity that take place around the states. The Kaufman Foundation for Entrepreneurship has found a very neat way of defining entrepreneurial activities. So the first thing they define entrepreneurial activity as is startup density. Startup density essentially is the number of new firms in a state per capita, right? Standardized by the population of the state. So if you come to Ohio, for example, if you want to get this number in Ohio, then what you're looking at is the number of startup companies across the state, the companies that were started this year, divided, right, by population of the state. And that allows you to look at different states in the US. So this goes from less entrepreneurial to more entrepreneurial. Which states do you think that are more entrepreneurial based on this picture and based on this measure?
Dakota.
Say that again?
North Dakota.
North Dakota, yes. Montana, right? The mountain states do very well. They do very well in the entrepreneurial measure, in this entrepreneurial measure. Now, we have a lot of work to do, right, in Ohio. Okay? But let's not be discouraged. We have a lot of work to do. But the mountain states do very well, even more so than the coast on this measure. Now, the second measure of entrepreneurial activity that they look at, that the Kaufman Foundation looks at, is the notion of the proportion of entrepreneurs that started something based on prior employment. If you recall, in the earlier pie chart I showed you, that pie chart was suggesting that majority of entrepreneurs that start businesses from prior employment are going to be more successful. So it's something that we consider to be important for the success of the venture. Then this measure is also a very useful measure. Again, which states do well? You can see them, okay? Coming up again, a different measure completely. This is a proportion, it's a percentage of entrepreneurs that started a business based on previous employment, okay? And then the final measure is just based on those that went from not being in self-employment into being self-employed. The reason why I'm spending time trying to make sure you understand the entrepreneurial side of things is that a lot of the series that we have for the next 1 or 2 weeks is based on inequality. So I'm sure you would hear a lot about inequality over the next couple of days. But on the entrepreneurship side, from what I understand, this is the one study in the series that at least will give you a flair of how that correlates with entrepreneurship. That's why I'm spending time trying to make sure we're on the same page as to the meaning of what entrepreneurship is. But of course, we care about inequality, okay? And inequality is essentially relative poverty in some ways, right? It's about how one person, like Tony Elumelu, who has $100 million to give in Nigeria, is able to have such wealth in Nigeria, but then in Africa around him, there's people there that don't even have dollars, even $2, $3, to be able to feed their families, right? That is inequality. The more you have that spread, obviously, the more you say that a society is unequal. If you look at the United States, we've gone through these periods over time, from 1920s till now, where we've got these movements in inequality. And again, this has been passed out based on the Midwest, the South, the West, the Northeast, and of course, the United States. And in fact, this data set is what we use for some of our analysis. So these folks have been very kind to kind of take us through history to understand the trends of inequality in our society, in the United States. Okay? And you can see these movements. Okay? You can look at it. And what you can see, I guess you know what the takeaway is, right? What is the takeaway when you look at this picture? What is one takeaway if you're thinking about nowadays? So if we're over here, what is one key takeaway? As you're looking at the graph. Inequality is what? Growing, yes. It's increasing, right? At some point in our history, it dipped, but it's going up on the rise again. So there is such a thing that we have high levels of inequality in the US at this point. So it's important to note that. Inequality is related to absolute poverty, is related to, but is a different construct than absolute poverty. Inequality is how unequal the income levels of people are, in terms of the income inequality, how unequal their income levels are across society. But absolute poverty is, simply put, a head count of people that are living below the poverty line, a defined poverty line in the society. Okay, so it's a count of households, for example, in Ohio that are living below the poverty line in Ohio. That's what it is, a proportion. So it's absolute poverty. So you can have that and still have inequality. You see what I'm saying? So you can still have absolute poverty and inequality. Okay? So eliminating absolute poverty is a very good objective to have, not just for policy reasons, but there's belief in the literature that as you eradicate absolute poverty, that oftentimes leads to lesser inequality over time. Okay, so as prosperous as the United States is, you would not believe it. As prosperous as we are, nationwide, we had 14.8% rate of inequality, right? 14.8. We had an all-time high of poverty rate of 15.1% in 2010. But since then, we've gained a few more points, 1 decimal point, but not a lot. Still a lot of work to do. Okay? So I've given you the background. So now what I want to do is to show you our primary interest in the study that we did. And the primary interest is to look at this triangle with particular attention on this connection between inequality and entrepreneurship, and then to see how entrepreneurship also relates to poverty. We're not looking at this. There are some studies that have looked at this connection. For this study, what we're looking at is to understand whether, if it is possible, that inequality has an effect on entrepreneurship. And if so, can we go further and say, what types of entrepreneurial activities could lead to lower poverty rates? Make sense? Okay, so the first hypothesis which we make is that inequality, greater inequality, is associated with greater entrepreneurship. Okay? And there's reason to believe that this is the case. There are some studies before that have nibbled at it a little bit, but they haven't really made it quite clear. So, but what we do is that we take a stand and say, if the poor are abundant, wages will be low as you expect, and which makes it more tempting to be an entrepreneur in that environment. So the notion of opportunity cost, right? And that's why when you go to places like Africa, societies that have high levels of inequality, you would see people more likely to get into entrepreneurial activities because there's not much of an option. The opportunity cost is not as high, right? There's no big job waiting for you out there to go and work. So there is some prior literature that suggests that inequality, and this particular study is a very interesting one that talks about the fact that inequality directly arises from people's perceptions of the gap between them and the rest of society. So inequality, based on that gap, leads them to take entrepreneurial activities based on that. So that's sort of our first hypothesis. The second hypothesis is that we consider the notion that even though Obama and a lot of policymakers are saying that entrepreneurship is good for society, we consider the fact that there are certain types of entrepreneurial activity that would have a greater impact on alleviating poverty than others. It sort of makes sense. There are certain types of entrepreneurial activity that would involve creating a company, employing people, and they are more likely to have a greater effect in alleviating poverty than when I identify an opportunity for myself to be self-employed and I have no reason or no incentive to employ other people. Okay? So it makes sense to posit that if that is the case, if I'm creating a company, if I have a startup company that intends to employ people, that I'm more likely to have an impact on poverty alleviation. Okay? Similarly, if I'm looking for an opportunity, you guys remember that 71%? The proportion of entrepreneurs that discovered opportunity for prior employment. If I'm discovering opportunities based on prior employment, I'm more likely to identify innovative solutions to problems. And in so doing, I'm more likely to alleviate poverty than if I was just taking the step to become self-employed. Okay? So that's sort of the nuance we bring to this. So what do we have data-wise? We have all 50 US states, including Washington, D.C., data on them from 1996 to 2014. Okay? We collect data from a variety of sources, including the US government sources, the Current Population Survey, US Census Bureau, places like the US Department of Agriculture. Okay? And what we do is that we leverage the Kauffman Foundation also that helped us collect the data from the government sources. We leverage their measures of entrepreneurial activity, including the firm-centric measures for those entrepreneurs that are starting companies. And we look at the opportunity-centric entrepreneurs, those entrepreneurs that are starting new ventures based on their prior experience. And then a measure of self-employment, which is entrepreneurs that are just getting into the business of employing themselves. Okay? And then we collect poverty data and inequality data. It's amazing what you can find in terms of inequality data. There are lots of data out there in terms of inequality in the US, income inequality. So we find that there are lots of state level data available for us here. So part of what we do in terms of the innovation of this study is that we try to make sure we account for all the measures of inequality in our measure. And I'll explain what we did in a minute. Okay? But remember, our objective, if I was to remind you, is to find that link, is to try and find the link between inequality and entrepreneurship, right? To explain what that link looks like, and to find the link between entrepreneurship, different forms of it, and poverty alleviation. So the statistical approach we take is rather simple. Let me explain. I'm not going to bug you with the details. But what we do is that we do three things. The first thing we do is that we use 6 well-established measures of inequality. And we say that in the literature, people have said that these measures, some measures have the advantages, some measures don't have the advantages, right? So, and there's pros and cons with each measure. And we say, let's find a composite measure that will bring it all into one, right? And find the common factor across these 6 measures. So that's the first innovation of what we do. And we do what is called a principal components analysis to extract that measure from the 6 measures. Okay? The second thing we do is that we look at what you call a correlation analysis. Correlation analysis is when you're trying to identify the relationship between 2 variables. Let's say you're looking at a relationship between age and height, right? What would the relationship be between age and height? Age and height. Is it positive or is it negative? Positive, right? Typically, okay? So that's a correlation analysis, and you can do a statistical analysis to determine that. So in this case, we do a statistical analysis that determines the correlation between the variables of interest. And then the third thing we do, which is really exciting for us, is that we actually try to predict using regression techniques. Regression allows you to predict how one variable impacts another, right? And that's taking it one step further. Again, I'm not trying to bug you down with the details. I just want to explain what we did so that when you see the results, you see why we're excited about what we're seeing in this paper. So, first of all, the results we find, these are the 6 measures of inequality. The first one is called the Atkinson Index. Are you guys familiar with these measures? Have you seen them before? So these are the measures that people have used to study income inequality around the world, right? These are all the measures, the entropy measure and so on. These are typically, like this one is the top 10% income share of a society, right? The greater the top 10% share in a society, the greater the what? Thank you, okay? So that's how this works. So we take all these measures and we say, these are all great measures. Let's put it all together. And we come up with a composite measure that is extremely reliable. In these kinds of experiments, if you get a 96% reliability, you're doing very well. You're saying this measure is reliable to the tune of 96%, right? So the second thing we do is we say, okay, that's that measure. We develop the measure, we throw it in. Let's find correlation between entrepreneurship, poverty, and we use food insecurity as an alternative measure of poverty. And we say, let's see what it looks like. Okay? Without being bogged down to details, let me explain something that we find very interesting. First of all, we find that entrepreneurs that are creating new companies, as you can see, looking at the correlation between these entrepreneurs and poverty, we find that they eradicate poverty. That's what you're looking at. Minus means you're lessening the poverty level. We know it's significant because we have a threshold for establishing significance. Okay, so we know it is significant. The second thing which is interesting is that if you look at the opportunity-centric entrepreneurs, which is right here, we know they're also eradicating poverty. We know it's significant because, again, it meets our threshold, right? So there are lots and lots of interesting things we learn about our hypothesis using this picture. And then when you look at inequality, what is the relationship? Who understands the relationship between inequality and firm-centric entrepreneurs? So 1 and 6. On face value, that positive sign, this is a positive relationship, is saying that indeed they are positively correlated. Increase in one will increase the other. Okay, so that's what we find. But this is preliminary. It's not conclusive yet. Then we do the regressions, and the regressions are very interesting in terms of what we find. We find that inequality in general supports our notion for all measures, pretty much all measures of entrepreneurship. So inequality leads to entrepreneurship, right? All 3 measures lead to entrepreneurship. The second thing we find is that the hypothesis that firm-centric, opportunity-centric entrepreneurs do better than these entrepreneurs is sort of supported. If you look at these signs, and I'm not sure when you look at the negative compared to the positive, what it's saying is that the more these firm-centric entrepreneurs, the more these opportunity-centric entrepreneurs, the lesser poverty you have in society in time period T+1. Remember I said that with regressions, you're trying to predict what happens the following year. Okay? Now look at what happens here. We didn't expect this. If you're getting self-employed, just getting self-employed, employing yourself, you do not help poverty levels in society. In fact, you make it worse if you were to buy into this relationship. Okay? So we didn't expect this. We're just saying that these two will be better than this. Okay? So we have other results, very interesting results, but let me take you to the big findings and the reflection on the findings that we have. One thing that we find is that overall, if you look at entrepreneurship as an instrument of poverty alleviation, certain types of entrepreneurial activities are better off than some types of entrepreneurial activities. Okay? So certain types of entrepreneurial activities tend to have some effects on alleviating poverty more than others. Okay? And we consider the role of alternative explanations, whether we're capturing whether public policy is involved, whether we're looking at other factors at the state level that might matter. And the results are not changed by those factors. Okay? So what does this mean to you? This is where you'll probably be more interested. So all these results we went through, what does it mean? I'll tell you what it means. The first thing is that when you look at entrepreneurship that involves firm activity and entrepreneurial activity that involves prior experience, it makes sense to consider that inequality in society tends to lead people in that direction. And to understand that people are likely to go in the direction of starting new businesses if you have a more unequal society. So from a public policy perspective, you are probably better served if you start finding ways to encourage them to do the right types of entrepreneurial activity. Because we know that ultimately it affects poverty. Okay? And then, of course, society is better off. For those of you that are going to school, society is better off when you're starting companies that are based on some experience you have, some prior experience you have in a certain industry that you bring to the enterprise, because you ultimately help alleviate poverty based on that experience. Okay? Any questions? And I know a lot of it was empirical, but this is where at least we can clarify questions in terms of what does it mean. Oh, by the way, the glass half empty or half full picture there is supposed to tell you a story. Who understands what the glass half full, half empty means? What does it mean in this context? Why would I have a glass half full, glass half empty for this talk? Yes?
You can look at like this information and see it in like a positive, like how to help, or like negative, like there's like so much like inequality. So
Yes. So inequality is a bad thing, right? We can all agree on that. But guess what? Inequality also can be what? Opportunities for what? entrepreneurship. And you know this. That's what social entrepreneurs are doing. Because when you have inequality, it means it's an opportunity for entrepreneurship, social and otherwise, right? So that's a big thing. It's about framing the problem. We have a problem. The United States has inequality. Many countries in the world are unequal. There's no doubt. But the question is, how can we use entrepreneurship in an unequal society to create prosperity and to eradicate poverty? Okay? Because if you eradicate poverty, ultimately you can eradicate inequality. Yes?
So from a policy perspective, are you encouraging more microloan kinds of opportunities or something like that?
That's a great question. I'm actually, from a policy perspective, recommending. Okay. So the question is, from a policy perspective, am I recommending microloans and smaller loans to entrepreneurs? Okay. The reason why that may not be helpful in this case is our study actually suggests the opposite. That the microloans that is being given in some cases may not necessarily be creating the right types of entrepreneurs. And people have said this in many ways before. If you think about microfinance has been a phenomenal thing, right, in eradicating poverty in Bangladesh and many parts of the world. But there is a recognition that sometimes it doesn't do as good a job in eradicating poverty as much as if you found ways to provide the entrepreneur with better resources, more resources. So as you know, it sounds almost intuitive to say that if we can find ways to provide them with bigger, better resources, entrepreneurs can do a better job helping society. The microloans obviously can help to some extent, but our results are suggesting that we have to be careful with those kinds of small efforts that are targeted at individuals as opposed to things that can help us scale more. Yes?
So you said that being self-employed makes inequality increase?
That's what our results are suggesting.
Yes.
It is preliminary, so we have to take it with a grain of salt, but that's what that relationship is suggesting, that it is possible that it leads to poverty. And I think I know why, but go ahead.
Why do you think?
So the reason, at least in this environment, that might lead to more poverty is self-employment sometimes means if someone is employing themselves, they don't necessarily mean that they're creating wealth. It means that they have income, right? So they might still be counted as poor in society, statistically as being poor, even though they're trying to create a company.
They're just like sitting on their wealth and not like spreading it. Like,
Or maybe they're not making as much money yet from the self-employment. So, but they're being counted as being statistically poor. Yes?
Yeah. Based on my own experience, and you know what I've read, certainly people who are small entrepreneurs, as they're initially starting, are going to be eating bread and water until they're more successful.
That's right.
So if you count them along with other entrepreneurs, yeah, they're living in poverty.
That's right.
But they're
Building.
hopefully building towards something in the
Yeah,
future.
yeah.
So it could be somewhat misleading to lump them all together. You know,
Right.
the ones who are before 5 years and after 5 years might be very different.
And actually that's really an excellent comment, because I probably should have clarified how this measure is measured. The way this is measured is measuring for that time period people that did not have a business previously within a few months before. So it's almost as soon as they started it. So that's why you're seeing that poverty. So you're right. Over time, that can clear away. So you're quite right. So that's why, you know, as exciting as the results seem, we're careful. And that's why I like the fact that you brought the question. We're careful not to say that this is conclusive in any way. But it's just an interesting to find it actually positive. I don't think we went into this thinking it was going to be a positive relationship. Other questions? Yes?
Can we go back to the previous slide, the right before this?
Yes.
There you talked about some of these public policies aimed at entrepreneurial activities. What kind of public policies do you think of that promotes and spurs entrepreneurship, but that doesn't lead to a higher level of inequality? So let's say we think of tax incentives or a lot of business-friendly initiatives, and those things cause more inequalities. So they take a lot of it at the local government or state governments. They take money away from social expenditure to the business expenditure. So that's what I would think.
That's a brilliant question, and I love the fact that we're getting into this detail, right? So you're right. That's precisely going back to the point I was made earlier. That's the problem. Some of these policies are not doing the job. That's what we're saying. And why we said human capital, why we mentioned this human capital, is that the policies that actually can encourage entrepreneurship are those that encourages building the right sets of human capital to young folks like you that would allow you to do a better job when you start a business. So when Obama in 2011 started Startup America, there were about 4 components to their public policy. One component is the tax incentives. The second component is access to finance. The third is mentoring, right? And I can't remember what the fourth is, but that mentoring part, it's so critical because it allows an entrepreneur who is struggling, who is facing difficulties that other people have gone through, to have someone they can talk to enable them to figure out the problem and to solve their problem that they're facing. So anything around building human capital, anything that suggests that someone is gaining experience that would help them do what they're doing better is likely to be much more beneficial than just giving people tax breaks, making the tax code more complicated and creating inequality in the society. The spillover effects of that could be adverse, unintended adverse effects. Does that address your question? Okay. So you're right. That's I should have mentioned this. My co-author is he's a professor of finance and public policy and he's Ontario chair for public policy at York University. So most of his work is in public policy. And really his interest in this study is based on that public policy. What can we tell policymakers? Because more is not necessarily better, right? Having just all these public policies that do not have well-targeted missions don't really help. You have to be a bit more precise. You have to be a bit more sophisticated in terms of how you do it. Yes?
Okay, well, I told you we had social workers.
Yes.
All right, so, my interest in this is that, for example, we have people who are growing up in communities where their opportunities for regular jobs that make a decent living are very low. They don't have the connections, they don't have the schooling, etc. And then we also have a population called LAPS that's coming out of prison and jail. And there's a lot of stigma and some challenges to try to get jobs. And so for those people starting their own businesses, even if they're very small, car washing, I had a guy come to my door to show my driveway. I mean, those kinds of, which are small, but they are entrepreneurial activities that could lead to at least a subsistence living. How can we encourage that to happen more? What are the opportunities to make that happen? Because some of the entrepreneurial activities that you're saying are successful, it seems to me, again, not knowing all the details, would be great for those people who already have connections, already have the training and education, and have some form of, a little bit of wealth already. But for those people who don't, what can we do to get them going and provide them with support and encouragement?
Good question. Very, very good question. Again, I go back to education. So at the Center for Entrepreneurship here at Ohio University, one of the things that we think that distinguishes us from other centers for entrepreneurship is our region, right? We have a region that needs a lot of what you described, a lot of those kinds of funding assistance, mentoring, those kinds of things to make them start businesses and become self-sufficient. So the answers lie still in some kind of education that would allow them more likelihood to succeed. Because the dangers of not having some kind of, not necessarily formal education, but some kind of training or informal mentoring kind of education is that people, they struggle with this, right? And we've seen that when they start a business, because they don't have a sense how you do a business plan, even for a car wash, or how you do your financials, it goes on there. So what we want to do is to find ways to increase the odds that they can succeed. My sense, and based on this research, but also previous research, is that you can never go wrong with human capital. And by human capital, we're trying to say not just giving them formal education, but giving them some kind of experience, some kind of apprenticeship, for example. People talk about apprenticeship a lot nowadays, where you have like an apprentice entrepreneur working with one that is going through maybe already educated in the car wash business and learning the tricks of trade. And then finding ways to coalesce support around the region. There are a number of efforts around this region to actually support these entrepreneurs. But to answer your question, I believe education is key to it, but also I believe that having a network of support that they can go and reach out to and get some advice, get some resources to bridge those gaps is essential. It's essential. And if I'm to take this to Nigeria again, the reason why Tony Elumelu is doing what he's doing is that it's not just the money. The money is part of what he's giving them. The other thing he's giving them is he's trying to bring them into this network of entrepreneurs that can help them figure out some of these problems. Because as you can imagine, if it is difficult to do in America, just imagine what entrepreneurs in a place like Africa are going through. So his sense is that the framework does not exist. The institutional framework and support mechanisms don't exist. And those frameworks, to the extent that they are providing mentoring and providing some kind of education is very helpful. The low-hanging fruit people often go to is financing, right? They need more financing. I'm always very careful. I do research in entrepreneurial finance. I'm very careful to say that finance is everything. It helps. But if you give someone finance and they're not ready and they don't understand what to do with it, they go through the money very quickly. So when I used to invite entrepreneurs that have been through different rounds of financing to my class to talk to my students, they would always tell you, be careful when you go and receive funding, because some people don't know how to allocate the funding properly and they go through it. We need to increase the odds of entrepreneurs succeeding. If there's one to take away from this, we need to increase the odds of entrepreneurs succeeding, not just for themselves. Because if they succeed, right, society is better off. So, and to increase those odds, they need to be able to do something that engages them or engages their experience on some kind of human capital. Yes?
So I want to push back a little bit on this idea of inequality being such a great thing, because it does seem to me that there might be a threshold at which point inequalities could get so high in a society that it would be shutting down any kind of entrepreneurial processes, because people wouldn't have access to sufficient resources. They wouldn't be able to break through that barrier if the barrier got too high, right? I mean, because the implications of your findings potentially could be, well, all we need to do in society is make sure that wealth just keeps getting more and more unevenly distributed, and that's going to create this incentive for entrepreneurship in society, because it's going to be the job makers out there, because they're going to, these common refrains that they're going to be reinvesting back in society whatever wealth or income that we're pushing up towards them. And I'm concerned that maybe your results, they're based on data from 1996 to 2014. It's a time period that's already high inequality. Mm-hmm. Some of those maps you were showing us suggest that there might be some regional outliers, or there might be a state like North Dakota where the data on what counts as entrepreneurship, I mean, are we talking about the oil wells out there that are getting started up? Is that what's putting North Dakota on the top of the list of entrepreneurship? I mean, is that really what we're thinking about? And over the last year and a half, as oil prices have dropped, is North Dakota suddenly not looking like such a great place anymore? So maybe you could address some of those concerns, some of those questions.
And those are excellent questions. So let me start backwards. So in terms of North Dakota, that state actually, by the way, I think is Montana than North Dakota. But in terms of that, we control for those effects. We have state fixed effects to control for state level factors that we're not observing in the data. So even after the controls, the effects we find still hold, right? So what that suggests is that it's not an oil boom, it's not some other factors we're not observing, because we are trying to control for the factors that we're not observing, unobservables. So then going to what you said, I understand how I'm sensitive to what you said about looking at this as meaning that inequality is good. I'm not suggesting that inequality is good at all.
it might look like the results are saying that the inequality is good. I'm not suggesting. I'm saying that we have inequality, right? We're already dealing with inequality. What we're saying is a pathway out for people that are in these kinds of situations. So the data seems like it's saying inequality is good, but what we're seeing, we're making an observation, an empirical observation, that more inequality leads to more entrepreneurial activity. And in your question, I like what you said. Is there a threshold where it gets to and people might feel locked out? They can't do anything anymore. They won't even become entrepreneurial. That is possible. That's something we're actually hoping to investigate further, whether there's a threshold, because I suspect because this is a US sample, we may not necessarily observe all the things that we might want to observe. But there may be a threshold when if inequality becomes way too high, then people might become very discouraged from doing anything at all. And in this current analysis, we haven't considered it. But we've thought about it, and we're finding ways to see if we can address it. Yes.
So as far as with people like feeling locked out, I think in a lot of cases they go to like underground entrepreneurial activities.
That's right.
So do you like have any way to measure that?
Well, there is a study. We didn't measure that in this study, but there are studies like Will Baumol at NYU that have investigated what he calls productive and unproductive entrepreneurs. And you are right. That's why that's such an interesting aspect of this. And we have gotten some feedback that suggests that that might be a useful extension. We're trying to stay away from that so we can first of all understand what we have. We have so much going on, we're trying to understand that. But certainly you're right. In fact, that's how I got to think about it. And the thought process is I've lived in Nigeria, so I've experienced firsthand what people being desperate looks like, right? I've experienced firsthand what it looks like. I've seen it firsthand. So, my thought process is that some of those unproductive activities might be an outlet, right, for inequality. So I'm not suggesting inequality is a good thing for society. I'm looking at this from a research perspective, trying to observe empirical patterns, and trying to find a way out to eradicate poverty in society. Yes?
But how do these people get into contact with mentors and these apprenticeships? And is there somewhere is this a place that a social workers can be useful? Because we might plug people into different resources, such as adoption resources. Is there ways that we can be helpful and plug them into these apprenticeships?
Well, that's an excellent question, right? The problem we have is that we don't have enough of those things, right? We really don't. One of the reasons why I love being in Athens is Athens' entrepreneurial community is very developed. There are efforts on the ground. The Innovation Center, right, and places like that are trying to do things more than I've seen anywhere before, at a scale that is even more than Athens. But we don't have enough of those things. I always tell my students, I said, I want to see an incubator at every corner of every street. I want to see it. That's my on a personal level. I want to see an incubator at every corner of every street. Why not? Because that's a place entrepreneurs can go and learn and figure things out and work with people like them going through the same kinds of struggle. Using the car wash example, if there was an incubator for people that are in the business of car wash, you may not need as many car washes in Athens, they can go and talk about it, right? And figure out their problems. Or people that have been through the same problems. So to answer your question, what you're seeing around the country is this upsurge in accelerators and incubators. I don't know if you guys, when I say incubator and accelerator, do you understand what I mean? These are places where new companies or people that are trying to start new companies go to, and they receive mentoring, they receive financing, they receive all kinds of support mechanisms. They are sprouting up all over the country. There are a couple in Columbus. There's one here in Athens. And those places are places that can provide what you're describing. But I don't think we have enough of them.
We would be better off giving the funding there instead of micro funds?
I think so. That's what I mean by more targeting. I think so. Because what happens, so I'm trying to find a way to say this. There's such a thing as mindless giving. You probably encountered that. You don't want to be giving just because you feel the urge to give something. One of the things that makes social entrepreneurs so different is that it's not about giving people fish, right? If you've seen this quote before, it's not about giving them fish. It's not about teaching them how to fish, right? It's about how you can show them how they can change the fishing industry. That's what Bill Drayton said, the founder of Ashoka. So, and that's fundamental because you can give fish and give fish and give fish, right? And it may not solve the problem. I'm convinced that we need a much more targeted, a much more deliberate attempt to nurture entrepreneurs. It has to be deliberate.
Sorry to keep asking questions.
That's fine.
But I guess this is targeted to my social work class. But one of the reasons I wanted you to hear this and to see this is to think about ways that we can help people get out of poverty. And as referring to my question earlier, we know that certain people don't have access or have very difficulty accessing regular jobs. The job market is more closed to them. We know that, for example, African Americans have half the, twice the unemployment that white people, and Hispanics as well. So, and people who come out of prison and people who have disabilities in some cases, there is a class differentiator. So, to me as social workers, I would love to see a greater emphasis on what you're talking about, trying to encourage policies that will provide training and education, in through high school and whatever, for people to start their own businesses and do their own kind of get their own hands dirty in a way to make sure that they get what they want, because society isn't necessarily providing it or allowing it.
That's true.
And the financing is more difficult for people who don't have the connections or, are considered not good risks.
Right.
So if we can increase these incubators and like we're trying to do in AMP, but we're not, like Job Family Services, as far as I know, is not connecting with the incubator groups and finding ways to bridge that for those people who need jobs and need to make some money.
Right. Well, that's an excellent comment. I probably should have mentioned this earlier. I'm the faculty advisor for a student club on campus called Enactors. Enactors is a club that helps students become social entrepreneurs. And the project that they're working on currently is a project that is targeted at single mothers, single parents in Athens region. Because when you think about statistics and think about Athens County, 32% are poor, right? If you look at single mothers, that number goes up, like you said. For those kinds of people, the numbers go up, and they have lots of different needs that prevent them from being able to get access to education because they have little children and things of that nature. So I'm very proud of my team. The students in my team were able to raise a diversity grant using Enactors from Walmart for $1,500 with the option to raise an additional $7,500 if they can show some credible things that they have done for this group of ladies in the Athens County region. So very soon you'll be seeing flyers around campus because they're having focus groups around campus trying to get ideas on how to make this work. With Enactors projects, students get into this not for the money, they get into it because they want to make sure that they can find a way of taking people away from situations of extreme poverty and difficulties.
What is the kind of activity that social work and people like yourself should be collaborating on?
You'll be hearing from
Not
us.
the enemy here.
I know. You'll be hearing from us, yeah? Yes. No, you're not at all. The reason why I want to present, and I made a conscious choice to present this study, is that this is, from an empirical standpoint, allows you to see what those relationships look like on the top level. With these other things we're talking about, we can have a conversation around them, in terms of other activities and other social entrepreneurial things that could be interesting to do. Like, for example, we talked about incubators. One of the things that we need is more social entrepreneurial incubators. People don't necessarily know how to get into social enterprise. A lot of people are able to get into things that are more for profit easily, but a lot of millennials want to be social entrepreneurs, and there's not enough of these kinds of places to get into. So I think that there's a potential for us to collaborate. And my students have actually said they're going to reach out, the active students, they reach out to social work regarding this focus group that they want to do.
Example of a social entrepreneur. We haven't really studied social entrepreneurship yet.
Okay.
In this class, that's
Okay.
like another chapter.
Okay?
So could you give an example and talk about that for 2 minutes? I know we don't have much time.
Okay. So one of my favorite examples of social entrepreneurs is Dorothy Stonewall. Dorothy Stonewall is an entrepreneur in New York City that in Harlem, she observed an interesting pattern. It's interesting, and I don't mean that it's a good thing, but it's a pattern. she found a lot of homeless people, right, in Harlem. Lots of homeless people on the streets, unemployed, right? And then she found old abandoned buildings all around Harlem, New York. So she's like, this is interesting. What is wrong with this picture, right? What is wrong with it? Can someone tell me? Yes. There are places for them to go live, right? And they could also be involved in rehabilitating those places. And that's precisely what she did. She put them to work and she was able to change this. I think it's called Youth Build. I can't remember the exact name. It's called either Youth Build. But she's done it so well, she's been invited around the country to do the same thing. So I think she's a remarkable person because that's what we call social bricolage. So there are different types of social entrepreneurs, and a social bricolage is a person that recognizes that the resources are already there. What you need is a business model that brings it together. So you look at it and you say, I have all the resources. How do I tie it all together? So she's one good example of it. The other example, if we have time, is Paige Ellison-Smith, the founder of the KID project, KID project during Hurricane Katrina. Lots of kids were being displaced by Hurricane Katrina. The parents were out of jobs. Paige Ellison-Smith was able to, in that situation, figure out how to find people that helped provide daycare, because the daycares were not there, the schools were not there. Provide daycare while their parents helped rebuild New Orleans. It was a model that worked so well that she was able to go to Haiti during the earthquake to do the exact same thing. That's the thing about social entrepreneurship. If it works well here, you can take it to the next place. That's why Mohammed Yunus, his first place was where? Bangladesh, microfinance. But today there's microfinance, there's a Grameen Bank in the US, in New York City and around the country. So if it works, you can definitely replicate it. That's actually why I like this, because that's about scalable. You can scale stuff, but you gotta figure out how to scale it first. Sorry, I went with 2 examples. I got greedy.
Questions? I really like this kind of talk. This Worse and Poverty indeed promotes this kind of interdisciplinary approach to inequality and poverty. So it's like me going back to my graduate years. So when we were talking about development, one group of students were talking about the importance of entrepreneurship, growth, and economic development. Another group of students, including myself, like inequality, that's like discrimination, that's the waste of human talents, and then redistribution, that's the most important thing. So, but at the end of the discussion, we all went out and drank and so that's like going back to that. Anyway, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you.